You, in December, spoke out on Christiane Amanpour's show about a story about a credible case of rape that a Palestinian accused Israeli soldiers of perpetuating. I'm just going to show this clip, and then I'm going to ask you something about it.
Sexual violence. I was part of the human rights vetting process for arms going to Israel, and a charity called Defense of Children International Palestine drew our attention at the State Department to the sexual assault, actually the rape, of a 13-year-old boy that occurred in an Israeli prison in the Moscovia in Jerusalem. We examined these allegations. We believed they were credible. We put them to the government of Israel. And you know what happened the next day? The IDF went into the DCIP offices and removed all their computers and declared them a terrorist entity. I think it is vital that atrocities not happen to anyone, not sexual violations, not any kind of gross violation of human rights.
So I think this was the first time that something like that was said on cable television. Did you get pushback from that?
I don't know what you mean by pushback.
Smeared, attacked? Did people complain? Did people?
People are always complaining on social media, right? And I don't, right. I try not to pay too much attention to that. But I think it was important to raise that issue because, in part, right? Sexual violence was, of course, sexual violence is weaponized, but you know what I mean? It was being used by the government of Israel as a means of continuing to press its case and to justify its actions in Gaza. And I think it was important to note that sexual violence has been committed and continues to be committed, frankly, by both sides. And that we cannot turn a blind eye to the atrocity that is sexual violence whenever it is committed. And I think we've seen some very disturbing reporting of the systematization of sexual violence through the Israeli detention center in Sde Teman, that is certainly concomitant with what Defense of Children International Palestine described happened in the Moscovia prison, and which I should note, since you asked me about the reaction I got, since that clip, I've had people reach out to me directly and say, thank you so much for saying that. When I was in Israeli detention, 20, 30 years ago, this happened to people I was with, or this happened to me as well. And I get the feeling that some of these people are sharing their stories for the very first time. It's incredibly moving. It's also incredibly heartbreaking, and it should not happen. And it needs to be brought into the light, and it needs to be stopped.
And can you tell us more about that case, to the extent that you can, obviously?
Sure. The case itself, you can go to the website of Defense of Children International Palestine and read it. Their case file is out there on their website. As I say, this was a boy who was brought into Israeli custody in the Moscovia detention center in Israel, in Jerusalem. And while there, was sexually assaulted, was penetrated by an inanimate object, and then reported this to their parents upon their release from custody. The name is not included in the DCIP report for obvious reasons. So this was an allegation that disturbed us greatly in the State Department, at least at the levels that I was working at, who were reviewing. There is a process in the State Department. I should point out it is a unique process that only exists for Israel. So for most other countries, the law says you cannot provide US military assistance to a foreign forces unit that is credibly alleged to be involved in a gross violation of human rights. And for every other country, before we provide the assistance, we vet the units to make sure that they are not credibly alleged in gross violations of human rights. For Israel, there is a different process where we provide the assistance first, and then we keep an ear out for allegations. And so there is something in the State Department, a body called the Israel Lehi Vetting Forum. And so I happen to sit on that forum, both because of my role in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, and also because at the time I was helping the Human Rights Bureau strengthen their review of arms transfers. And this was one of several cases that came to our attention that the forum said, yes, does look like a credible allegation of a gross violation of human rights. Unfortunately, in the Israel Lehi Vetting Forum, in addition to the, provide first and review second approach. Another difference is that the next step in that process, again uniquely, is that any potentially credible allegations are put to the government of Israel. So we ask them, hey, have you heard of this? Do you think it's credible? Are you doing anything about it? Again, that's not a step in the process for any other country. And that was essentially the problem here, that we were ready to move forward and therefore had to put it to the government of Israel under that process. And as I say, the day after we put it to the government of Israel, they went in and they shut down the offices and confiscated all the computers of DCIP. And I think that, certainly shook the confidence of a lot of people in the State Department in the process. Unfortunately, it didn't lead to any change to date. As far as I know, that file remains sitting in limbo in the Israel Lehi vetting forum and has not gone up to Secretary Blinken. And even if it had gone up to Secretary Blinken, as we just saw with his decision on Netzah Yehuda on Friday, it is unlikely that this administration would take any action to actually say that an Israeli security force unit cannot receive U.S. assistance, which is absurd.
Israeli government and much of the media, the Western media, repeated these claims of mass sexual violence committed by Hamas. And the evidence for that was, I would say, very lacking. And then we see that there is overwhelming evidence of sexual assault committed by Israel, and that barely gets mentioned in the press. And certainly there are no politicians talking about it. I think maybe Rashida Tlaib probably did. She's pretty exceptional on this. But there's a recent report from B'Tselem, which is the Israeli human rights organization, called Welcome to Hell. And this, again, is an Israeli human rights organization. And it says acts of torture, sexual abuse, rape, and murder are occurring on a systemic level. They called Israeli prisons torture camps. And we have also an extremely terrible story about these soldiers being accused of sexual abuse. And I'm just going to play this video from Israeli news channel I-24 because it has so much information in it. And I think it's important to note that this is not from a network that's at all critical of Israel. So let's just take a look at this.
Protesters yelling shame and disrupting a hearing in the Israeli Supreme Court on Wednesday about the future of the controversial State Teiman military facility, where Palestinian detainees have been held throughout the war in Gaza and where repeated allegations of soldiers abusing detainees have made headlines both in and outside Israel.
The matter is a matter of the laws of war. Even in times of war, it is strictly forbidden according to international law and according to Israeli law to abuse detainees. The laws of war are intended for exactly this, to prevent a situation in which enemy subjects who are in custody are harmed.
The detention facility was opened shortly after the war in Gaza began, meant to hold Hamas detainees until they could be transferred to prisons. According to the state prosecutor, the facility is of key importance.
This place must continue to operate. We are at war. It is a vital security interest of the state of Israel.
On Tuesday night, Israeli Channel 12 aired security footage from the facility showing a group of reserve soldiers picking out one detainee out of many lying on the ground, taking him to a corner, gathering around him, and covering themselves with shields from the camera. The reporter, Guy Peleg, says that shortly after the incident, the detainee is taken, bleeding, to hospital with injuries described as complex, and that the medical conclusion is unequivocal, injuries caused by the insertion of an object. Late last month, 9 Israeli soldiers were arrested for the alleged rape of a Palestinian detainee at State Teiman, causing protests and riots from Israeli nationalists, with backing from Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who all say that at a time of war, the country must gather around and protect the soldiers. At one point, up to 700 people were held at State Teiman, but hundreds of Palestinian detainees have been transferred out of the facility in the last months.
Today, 28 prisoners are held in State Teiman. The law's instructions and regulations established by the Minister of Defense determine a series of conditions that must be met in the detention facility. The question at the center of this meeting is whether these instructions are implemented now in the State Teiman detention facility.
The Israeli military says it is investigating the case, which has caused uproar in Israeli society. Earlier this week, a report released by Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem says dozens of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons and detention centers since the war began describe incidents of violence, torture, starvation, and sexual abuse.
The jail was very, very tough, as you can see in my situation. It is an unfair detention, and there is killing, and they torture us with metal sticks. We were subject to all kinds of torture.
The report stated that the majority of the 55 prisoners interviewed for the report were released without an indictment.
It's stunning. It's so disturbing. The fact that they then videotape themselves engaging in what seems like with a sexual assault. There's no potential reform of this. It's totally irredeemable, in my opinion.
I think that's right. I think that, what we see here is very much in keeping with what we've seen in the TikTok videos from IDF soldiers in Gaza. Which is just a complete dehumanization of the Palestinian people. In fact, we saw that today. I think it was Haaretz that has a report today about a Palestinian detainee who was being used, being put in front of an Israeli unit that was involved in munitions clearance and bomb clearance. And they put him out there so that if anything detonated, he would be killed rather than them. And when asked why, they said, because our lives are more important than his. And I think that's what a lot of this boils down to. There is a sense of dehumanization within the of the Palestinian people across, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, significant segments of Israeli society, including its security forces, and at the same time a sense of superiority that allows any sort of action, whether it is the mocking of people whose houses have been destroyed, going into, girls' bedrooms and holding up their underwear, whether it is this sort of sexual assault and demeaning treatment that we see in State Hamas, whether it is torture, when you don't think that the quote unquote enemy, and let's be clear, we're talking about, for the vast majority of them, innocent civilians here, is an equal human being, this is the behavior that results. And I think addressing that is not simply a question of reasserting unit discipline. It is a question that will require a wholesale reconsideration within Israeli society of the Palestinian humanity and of their own humanity.
Yeah, and it's just shocking also that this hasn't been getting news coverage in the United States and the Western media. I mean, Israel's covering it because it is just so astonishing and so newsworthy. The media here is clearly making the decision to not cover this.
Yeah, I think there's, a lot of clear double standards in our media coverage, right? And that comes out, I think, most clearly when you flip it around and say, well, if this was being done by the other side, would this be getting media attention? And of course, the answer is yes. And of course, the answer is yes when you think about civilian harm and civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian homes, the bombing of hospitals, the killing of doctors, of journalists, all of these things. If the roles were reversed, there would be wall-to-wall press coverage here. So I'm sorry to say that the dehumanization of Palestinian lives isn't simply contained to the Israeli Defense Forces and Israeli society, but is very active in our own society as well. And it's something that we need to take a good hard look at ourselves in the mirror for. There's
actually another video I want to show, which is, still shocking. It's hard to be shocked anymore after this. Legitimate trigger warning, not sarcastic trigger warning. But here's a conversation in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, precisely about whether or not what was done to one of these detainees who was penetrated with sticks. And they actually discussed whether or not that was legitimate in the Knesset. So let's take a look at this.
משטרה צבאית הגיעו לעצור חיילים ששמרו על מחבלי נוח'בה. והחיילים בשדה תימן, מתקן מעצר של מחבלי נוח'בה, ומשטרה צבאית שם הגיעה לעצור כמה לוחמים שם שכנראה בגלל איזה שהם טענות של יחס למחבלי נוח'בה, ויש שם אירוע של התבצרות וכולי. הטרלול שהמדינה שלנו נכנסת אליו סביב הסיפור הזה הוא מטורף וצריך להפסיק אותו, ואני חושב שצריך פה לתת דוגמה אישית, ואני אומר עכשיו, ואני קורא לחברי הקואליציה לעשות כמוני, אני קם ואני יוצא מפה, ואני לא הולך להצביע יותר על שום דבר, עד שהסיפור הזה והטרלול הזה, שיש מי שבפרקליטות חושב שאפשר לבוא ולעצור חיילים על דברים שעושים למחבלי נוח'בה, לא נגמר. אוקיי? ואני מאוד מבקש, ואני חושב שחבריי בקואליציה טוב יעשו, אם יעשו כמוני. אנחנו לא יכולים להמשיך כרגיל.
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו.
אוקיי.
הכל. הכל.
זה מה שרציתי.
הכל, האנשים האלה, אתה יודע מה עשו?
So he's irate about the fact that people are upset about the rape. He's not irate about the rape. And then when asked if that sexual violence is legitimate, he doesn't grapple with it. He says, yes, it is.
So, I mean, let me just take this back to where we started the conversation, right? Which is that, again, today the United States announced or informed Congress that we're moving ahead with over $20 billion worth of arms transfers to a security force that is in this state with a government that is in this state. I just don't understand how, certainly on a moral basis, but even in accordance with our own laws, which, for example, say that we cannot provide arms to a country that has a continuous pattern of violations of human rights. If there is a country where not only has there been, repeated massacres on the ground, repeated killings of civilians, repeated attacks on civilian infrastructure like water, like hospitals, the cutting off of food to the point of starvation, and, government officials agitating for rape in prisons and the permissibility of anything, the notion that we can go ahead with major arms sales into that environment is, to my mind, unthinkable. And, really, I think, makes us question the judgment and the connection, frankly, to reality of some of the senior foreign policy leadership in this country right now.